Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on perhaps the least exciting historical deep dive we've ever attempted. Seriously. Forget thrilling battles, scandalous emperors, or even slightly interesting pottery shards. Tonight, we are lowering the energy level to geological zero and contemplating the inner life, or perhaps, the outer stillness, of a single, anonymous cobblestone that once lay in a Roman road. Imagine yourself standing on a dusty, ancient track. The sun beats down. You can almost feel the vibrations of distant carts and marching feet through the soles of your worn sandals. You look down at the stones underfoot, solid, worn, seemingly lifeless. But each one has a story, albeit an incredibly long and, let's be honest, profoundly boring one. You probably won't survive this one without drifting off, which is exactly the point, so buckle up, or maybe, unbuckle everything and just relax. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, let's begin your story. Yes, your story, because for the next hour or so, you are going to be this stone. Forget your worries, your to-do list, the existential dread that keeps you up at night. Imagine shedding it all, layer by layer, like old, weathered strata. Sink down, 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 past the dusty surface of the modern world, past the layers of soil, past the roots of trees, past the memory of sunlight and air. You are descending into immense pressure, into profound silence, into a darkness that has known no dawn for epochs beyond human comprehension. This is where you began, not as a cobblestone, not even as a recognizable rock on the surface, but as something else entirely. Perhaps you were once part of a seabed, accumulating sediment over millions upon millions of years, tiny grains of sand, fragments of ancient shells, fine particles washed down from long-vanished mountains. Layer upon layer, building up, pressing down, squeezing the water out, compacting everything until it hardened into sedimentary rock. Or maybe you were born in fire, molten magma cooling deep within the Earth's crust, crystallizing slowly under unimaginable heat and pressure into a mass of interlocking mineral grains. Or perhaps, you were one kind of rock transformed into another, caught between colliding tectonic plates, heated and squeezed and twisted until your very structure was fundamentally rearranged, a metamorphic rock, forged in the slow, violent ballet of the planet's crust. Whichever origin story is yours, the common thread is time. Vast, unthinkable amounts of time. We talk about Roman history spanning a few centuries, maybe a millennium if we're generous. We talk about human history going back a few thousand years. Your existence, before you ever saw the light of day, was measured in eons. Imagine waiting around for 1,000,000 years. Then do that 1,000 times. That's the kind of timescale we're talking about. You were, in a very literal sense, a deep sleeper. You were a homebody of the most extreme kind, residing comfortably, or perhaps uncomfortably, but you had no frame of reference, miles below the surface, oblivious to whatever was happening up there. Dinosaurs roaring, continents drifting, ice ages grinding. You were just there. A solid, inert mass, part of the planet's deep architecture. The pressure was immense, a constant, crushing embrace from all directions. It would flatten anything soft, but you were hard, composed of minerals that had locked into place, resolute against the squeeze. The heat was perhaps significant too, a steady warmth radiating from the Earth's core, a stark contrast to the fleeting warmth of the sun you would one day feel. You existed in a state of perfect, boring equilibrium. There was no change, no movement within yourself, just being. For millions, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of years. If you had feelings, you would have felt, well, probably nothing. You were the ultimate stoic, unmoved by the passage of time or the weight of the world above. Slowly, imperceptibly, things began to change. The grinding forces of plate tectonics, those impossibly slow shoves and scrapes of the Earth's crust that reshaped continents over millennia, began to lift the section of crust where you resided. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden jolts or upheavals from your perspective. Just a gradual, relentless pushing upwards, a process so slow it makes watching paint dry look like a high-speed chase scene. Simultaneously, the rock layers above you were being worn away by erosion, wind, water, ice, patiently nibbling away at the surface, carrying particles downstream, gradually lessening the burden on the rock beneath. You were on nature's slowest possible conveyor belt, heading towards the surface. As the weight above lessened, the pressure you felt would have slightly, infinitesimally decreased. A change so subtle it wouldn't even register on a seismic graph, let alone in your non-existent consciousness. But the journey had begun. You were rising, over centuries, over millennia, towards a destiny you couldn't conceive. You were still deep underground, mind you, miles from the surface, but the long upward trek had commenced. This slow, inexorable ascent is a fundamental part of the geological cycle that brings buried rock to where it can be accessed. It's a testament to the immense power of forces that operate on timescales utterly alien to us. The rocks that make up Roman roads, like you, were typically sourced from local quarries whenever possible, or transported from significant distances if specialized stone was needed. The sheer scale of Roman quarrying was enormous. They were masters of extracting vast amounts of stone for buildings, monuments, and, of course, their legendary road network. Some quarries were so large they reshaped entire hillsides. It wasn't just hacking away at rock, it was an industrial-scale operation, often involving sophisticated techniques for the time, like using wedges, levers, and even controlled fires to crack large blocks. Yet, despite this technical prowess, there was still a hint of the mystical or superstitious around such deep intrusions into the earth. A quirky tidbit: some Roman quarry sites bear inscriptions or carvings asking for divine favor or protection, suggesting that even the practical Romans felt a need to appease the spirits of the earth they were disturbing, or perhaps just ward off bad luck, which, given the dangerous nature of quarry work, was probably just common sense. Historians still argue whether the primary labor force for these massive quarrying operations consisted mostly of enslaved people, professional free stonecutters, or even soldiers engaged in public works during peacetime. It was likely a mix, varying by region and time period, but the debate highlights the complex social and economic structures behind Roman infrastructure projects. Regardless of who was doing the work, their goal was to pry rocks like you from your ancient slumber. You, meanwhile, were still just waiting. Waiting in the dim, cool embrace of the earth, unaware of the millennia of slow movement that had brought you within reach of entirely new forces. Forces far more dynamic, far more violent, and with intentions you could never have predicted from your quiet, deep existence. The eons of peace were drawing to a close. The surface, with its light, its noise, its rapid, chaotic life, was approaching. And waiting at that surface were beings who saw you not as an ancient part of the planet's crust, but as raw material, as a tool, as a necessary component for their own, relatively fleeting, creations. Your long, silent journey was almost over. You had spent epochs in stillness, a deep part of the Earth's patient structure, slowly ascending over geological ages. But geological time moves at a pace that makes continental drift feel like a sprint. The change that was about to happen to you would be abrupt, noisy, and utterly disruptive from your perspective, if you had one. You were about to meet the short, frantic timescale of human endeavor. The pressure around you, once a constant, unwavering embrace, began to shift. You felt vibrations, faint at first, then growing more insistent. A rhythmic thud-thud-thud, a sound that hadn't existed in the quiet darkness where you resided. It was getting louder, closer. This wasn't the slow groan of shifting plates or the distant rumble of an ancient earthquake. This was something new, something sharp and deliberate. Then came a scraping, a tearing sound, as the softer layers above you were stripped away. This wasn't the gentle erosion of wind and rain. This was impatient, artificial removal. You were being uncovered. The earth above you, your ancient blanket, was being systematically removed by picks, shovels, and sheer human muscle. Light began to penetrate, not the soft, filtered light of dawn, but a harsh, sudden brightness that pierced the gloom you'd known for millennia. Dust filled the air, thick and choking, a fine grit that settled on everything. The thudding continued, closer now, the impact jarring your very being. You felt it resonate through your structure, a feeling utterly alien after an eternity of silent equilibrium. Then came the direct assault. The vibrations intensified, accompanied by sharp, metallic clangs. You were being struck. Heavy, iron-tipped tools, wielded by determined hands, were hammering against your surface, searching for weaknesses, trying to pry you from your matrix. You felt chips breaking away, small fragments of yourself scattering into the dust. It was a violent, crude awakening. You were part of a larger rock face, a stubborn protrusion in the quarry wall, and the Romans wanted you out. The methods varied. Sometimes, they would identify natural cracks or fault lines in the rock and exploit them, hammering wedges deep into the fissures, slowly expanding them until huge blocks split away. It was like trying to open a stubborn jar lid, but with hammers and iron instead of hot water and frustration. Other times, they might drill holes along a desired break line, a laborious process involving pounding iron bars or chisels repeatedly, perhaps rotating them with simple tools. These holes might then be filled with wooden wedges, which were soaked with water. As the wood absorbed the water and expanded, it exerted immense pressure, hopefully enough to crack the rock along the line of holes. Imagine the patience required for that. It's enough to make you want to just give up and stay buried. One quirky tidbit about this process: some sources suggest that heating the rock face with fire and then rapidly cooling it with water was another technique used to induce cracking, exploiting the thermal expansion and contraction of the stone. Talk about a shock to the system after being cool for eons. This wasn't just about getting a rock, it was about getting rocks of a suitable size and quality. Not every piece of the rock face was destined to become a perfect block for a temple or a statue, or even a road cobble. You, apparently, had the right stuff, or at least, were in the right place at the right time. You were part of the material they needed for their ambitious road-building project. The sheer scale of Roman quarrying operations was immense. They were capable of extracting millions of cubic meters of stone over time, changing the landscape permanently. A mainstream historical fact: the Romans were pioneers in exploiting vast quarries, sometimes transporting stone hundreds of miles for major projects, a logistical feat that required sophisticated planning and engineering. The noise was relentless. The ring of hammers on metal, the grunt of men straining, the scrape of shovels, the occasional loud crack as a larger piece of rock gave way. And the dust, it was everywhere, coating everything, turning the air hazy. You were surrounded by the harsh reality of human industry, a stark contrast to the silent, slow world you had just left. Finally, after repeated blows and prying, you felt yourself detach. A sudden jarring shift, a sense of being free from the larger mass you'd been a part of for longer than life has existed on Earth. You were a boulder now, a rough, irregular chunk of rock, lying among debris at the base of the quarry face. You weren't a neat cube or a smooth sphere, you were just raw. An ugly, unfinished product of geological forces and human impatience. Your time in the quarry face might have been brief, a mere blip compared to your prior existence, but it was impactful. You were no longer just there, you were here, exposed to the air, the light, the noise, and the constant presence of humans. You felt, well, you didn't feel, you're a rock. But if you did, you might feel a bit disoriented, perhaps a little violated. You were ripped from your comfortable, deep earth home and tossed into the bright, loud, confusing surface world. It's enough to make a rock want to roll back into the ground and hide. Historians still argue whether Roman quarry workers were driven by a sense of duty, the threat of punishment, or perhaps even a strange pride in the monumental scale of their work. It's hard to imagine finding joy in such backbreaking, dangerous labor under the hot sun, but perhaps the Romans had a knack for instilling a sense of purpose, or at least relentless efficiency, in their workforce. Regardless, they were good at it. They reshaped mountains and hillsides, leaving behind dramatic quarry faces that are still visible today, silent witnesses to their incredible capacity for hard work and resource exploitation. You were just one piece among thousands, probably millions, being extracted from this quarry. Some pieces would be destined for grander things, finely dressed blocks for public buildings, columns for temples, perhaps even part of a statue, though you were far too humble for that. You, and others like you, were being set aside for something more utilitarian, more grounded. You were destined for the roads. Your rough form, your inherent hardness, your willingness, unwillingness, but you're a rock, to endure constant abrasion, these were the qualities that made you suitable. You weren't pretty, you weren't remarkable in any way that would catch the eye of a sculptor. You were practical. You were durable. You were boring. Perfect for a Roman road. As you lay there, a newly detached boulder in the quarry, the sounds continued. Other rocks were being broken free. Men shouted instructions. The rhythmic clang of hammers echoed off the quarry walls. You were just beginning your transformation from anonymous subterranean rock to humble road material. The next step wouldn't make you any prettier, but it would give you a shape more suited to your future purpose. You were about to undergo your first, and arguably most significant, haircut. You were a rough boulder, fresh from the quarry face, lying in the dusty debris. You weren't square, you weren't flat, you were just a lump. A sturdy, dense lump, but a lump nonetheless. Roman roads required something more regular, something that could fit snugly alongside its neighbors to create a solid, durable surface. Your current form wouldn't do. So, you were targeted for the next stage, shaping. This wasn't fine sculpting, this was brutal, practical modification. You were too big, too uneven, too lumpy. You needed to be reduced in size and given a usable form. This job fell to the stonecutters, or perhaps less skilled laborers tasked with the rough work. They approached you, likely selecting you from a pile of similarly sized rocks. The tools of their trade were simple but effective, heavy hammers, chisels, perhaps a tool called a delabra, a pickaxe-like tool with a chisel point on one end. The process began. Blows rained down upon you again, but this time with a more focused intent. The goal wasn't to break you free, but to break off the irregular bits, to knock off the corners, to split larger rocks into smaller, more manageable pieces. Whack! A chip flew off one edge. Thud! A heavier blow aimed at a natural fracture line. You felt the impact, the vibration, the slow, relentless chipping away of your substance. It was like being given a very aggressive, very painful haircut, except you're made of rock and have no hair. The stonecutters would examine your shape, look for prominent bulges or awkward angles, and aim their blows with surprising precision, considering the roughness of the task. They weren't trying to make you pretty, just functional. The ideal shape for a Roman road cobble, or pavimentum, wasn't a perfect cube or rectangle like modern set stones. Roman cobbles were often irregularly shaped polygons, rough squares, trapezoids, or just chunks with multiple flattish faces. The key was that they needed to be relatively flat on top and bottom, and have sides that could be fitted together reasonably snugly. You were being hammered into conformity. The sharp edges left over from your quarrying were blunted. Large protrusions were knocked off. If you were too large, they would attempt to split you, perhaps by repeatedly hitting a chisel driven into a crack, or by finding a weak point and hammering it until you fractured into 2 or more pieces. It was a process of reduction, of refinement by brute force. Think about the skill involved, even in this seemingly crude work. A good stonecutter knew how the rock would break, where the internal stresses lay. They could read the grain of the stone, anticipate its fracture patterns. A bad stonecutter might just shatter the rock into unusable fragments. So, despite the violence of the process, there was a degree of expertise involved. It wasn't just random smashing, it was directed, purposeful smashing. The noise was constant, the sharp crack of stone breaking, the dull thud of hammers on rock, the scraping of chisels. Dust was still in the air, finer now, produced by the constant chipping. Small fragments of stone littered the ground around you, the waste products of your transformation. You were literally losing pieces of yourself to become what the Romans needed. One mainstream historical fact: Roman roads were not just a layer of stones dumped on the ground. They were complex, layered structures, designed for drainage and durability. The pavimentum, the layer of cobbles you were destined for, was just the topmost layer of several. This sophisticated construction was a major reason for their longevity. While this was happening, perhaps you witnessed, if rocks could witness, some of the other activities in the quarry area. Maybe you saw oxen or mules being used to haul larger blocks, or carts being loaded with shaped stones like yourself, ready for transport. The quarry was a hive of activity, a place of hard labor and logistical organization. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a Roman industrial site. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this process: there's some evidence suggesting that different types of stone were sometimes preferred not just for their durability but also for the sound they made under traffic, or even for their color or perceived quality by the Romans. Although for a humble roachstone like you, utility was probably the primary consideration. But it's a fun thought: maybe the Romans had favorite rock sounds? Tap, tap, tap. Yes, that one sounds like a good roachstone. Thump, thump, thump. Nah, too dull. Probably not, but you never know. Historians still argue whether the standardization of Roman road construction techniques and materials was centrally dictated from Rome or evolved more organically through practical experience and local variations. While the general principles of layered construction were consistent across the empire, the specific types of stone used, and perhaps even the exact dimensions and shaping methods of the pavimentum stones, likely varied depending on regional resources and traditions. You, for instance, would be shaped from the stone available in your particular quarry, which might be different from the stone used in a road hundreds of miles away. As you were being shaped, you might have felt the rough hands of the laborers turning you, positioning you for the next blow. They would inspect you, checking if you were ready, if you had enough flat surfaces to sit correctly and join with your neighbors. You weren't undergoing a precise, measured transformation. It was a process of approximation, of making you good enough for the job. You didn't need to be perfect, just functional. Slowly, your rough edges were rounded, your awkward bulges reduced. You were becoming smaller, more compact, with several relatively flat faces. You were still far from smooth, still bearing the marks of the hammers and chisels that had worked on you. But you were no longer just a random boulder. You were beginning to resemble a Roman roadstone. You had a purpose now, a defined future shape. The process was probably relatively quick, compared to the eons it took to form you. Hours, perhaps a day at most, for a skilled worker to shape a few stones like you. But those hours were filled with noise, dust, and constant impact. You were being hammered into your destiny, literally. Once deemed sufficient, you would be set aside, probably added to a growing pile of similarly shaped stones. You were now finished with the initial shaping. You had survived the extraction and the brutal haircut. You were no longer just raw material. You were a prepared component, ready for the next step in your journey from deep earth to Roman infrastructure. That step involved leaving the dusty, noisy quarry behind and heading towards the construction site, wherever that might be. Your journey had begun. You were now one of many, a piece of shaped stone lying in a heap near the quarry entrance. No longer a rough boulder, you had been hammered and chipped into a usable form. You waited, not with patience, because you were a rock, but simply were, in the company of your equally uninteresting brethren. The noise of shaping continued nearby, a constant reminder of the process you had just endured. Then came another interruption. You were picked up. Not gently, of course. Human hands, calloused and strong, grasped you, perhaps tossed you, onto something hard and wooden. It might have been a cart bed, or perhaps a carrying frame. You landed with a dull thud amongst other stones, scraping against their rough surfaces. More stones were piled on top of you, pressing down, until you were just one layer in a growing mound of rock on a wheeled platform. This platform was a cart or wagon, likely a simple wooden structure with solid wheels, probably bound with iron for durability. These weren't smooth-riding vehicles, they were designed for strength and capacity, not comfort. Pulled by animals, oxen or mules, maybe sturdy Roman horses, these carts were the workhorses of Roman logistics. They moved everything from grain and building materials to troops and, of course, road stones like you. Loading was a manual, strenuous job. Imagine lifting thousands of stones, each one heavy, day after day. It gives you a new appreciation for cranes and forklifts, doesn't it? Once loaded, the real journey began. There was a jolt as the animals strained and the heavy cart started moving. The wheels creaked and groaned, the wood of the cart bed rattled, and the stones piled within shifted and grated against each other. You felt the constant vibration of movement, a new sensation after your deep stillness and your recent, localized hammering. The sound was a persistent rumble, punctuated by the clop-clop of hooves, the jingle of harness, and the occasional shouts of the cart driver. The surface you traveled on was likely not yet a finished Roman road. It might have been an existing track, a dirt path, or perhaps a rough service road created specifically for the construction project. This meant the ride was far from smooth. You would have bounced and jolted over ruts, stones, and uneven ground. The cart pitched and swayed, throwing you against your stony companions. It was a constant, low-level chaos of bumps and scrapes. You were literally on a road to nowhere, yet. Dust was your constant companion. The movement of the cart and the animals kicked up clouds of it from the dry ground. It settled on you, on the other stones, on the cart, on the animals, on the driver. You were covered in a fine, pervasive powder, the ground you were traveling over being churned into the air. It probably got into your tiny pores and crevices, making you feel even grittier than usual. The pace was slow. Oxen and mules aren't exactly speed demons. They plodded along steadily, pulling the heavy load. The journey from quarry to construction site could be short or long, depending on where the road was being built in relation to the stone source. It might have been a few miles, taking a few hours, or a longer trek over several days if the quarry was distant or the terrain difficult. If it was a long journey, the carts would stop, perhaps at temporary camps set up along the route, or even at existing roadside inns, though your accommodation would be the ground next to the cart, obviously. A mainstream historical fact, Roman road construction was often undertaken by legions, particularly during peacetime, providing useful labor and keeping soldiers busy. This wasn't just military engineering. It was a massive public works program executed with military precision and organization. It's like the army building highways today, but with sandals and significantly more manual labor. Think about the logistics involved. Building a road required a continuous supply of materials, not just your layer of paving stones, but also the tons of gravel, sand, and smaller stones needed for the foundational layers. Carts like yours were constantly moving, a slow, steady stream of resources feeding the construction effort. It required careful planning to ensure the right materials arrived at the right place at the right time. Get it wrong, and construction stalled. Imagine the Roman equivalent of a traffic jam caused by too many gravel carts arriving at once. Probably less honking, more yelling in Latin. A quirky tidbit about Roman transport: while wheeled vehicles were common for bulk transport, people often traveled on foot, by horse, or in litters. The carts were primarily for cargo. The sheer volume of goods moved this way across the empire was staggering, enabling trade and sustaining the growing urban centers and military outposts. Historians still argue whether the Roman road network's primary purpose was military, facilitating the rapid movement of troops and supplies, or economic, promoting trade and communication across the empire. It was almost certainly both, the military needs often driving the initial construction, which then stimulated economic activity along the routes. For you, a humble stone, the reason didn't matter. You were just cargo on a journey driven by the demands of this vast, interconnected system. As you rumbled along, you might have passed other carts, perhaps carrying timber for scaffolding or tools for the workers. You might have seen groups of laborers walking alongside, or heard the distant sounds of construction work growing closer. The air might have carried the smell of sweat, animals, and freshly disturbed earth. You were moving through a landscape being actively shaped by human hands, a transition zone between the natural world and the engineered environment of the Roman road. You might have been exposed to the weather for the first time since your quarrying. Sun would beat down, heating your surface. Rain might have soaked you, turning the dust on you into a muddy film. You were experiencing the surface world in a new way, not passively lying in the earth, but actively being transported through its varying conditions. The jolting ride continued, a monotonous series of bumps and rattles. You were just a passive participant, enduring the movement, the dust, the noise, the constant scraping against your neighbors. It wasn't an exciting journey, it was necessary, practical, and utterly without glamour. Your purpose was to arrive, to be offloaded, and to be placed in your final position. The journey was just an unpleasant interlude between being shaped and being set. Finally, after what felt like a long time, even for a rock, the cart began to slow. The rumbling lessened, the creaking subsided, and eventually, you came to a halt. The constant motion stopped. You were still on the cart, pressed against other stones, but the jolting had ceased. The air might have been filled with different sounds now, the rhythmic thud of ramming tools, the chatter of many voices, the scrape of shovels. You had arrived at the construction site. Your journey as cargo was over. You were about to become part of something much larger than yourself, something that would endure long after the cart and the animals that pulled it were gone. You were at the edge of the road in progress, ready for the next stage of your transformation from raw material to integral component. You were offloaded from the cart, probably with as little ceremony as you were loaded. Maybe you were tossed onto the ground, or perhaps tipped out with a pile of other stones. The important thing was, you were at the construction site. The ground here was different from the dusty tracks you traveled on. It was a scene of organized chaos, a large trench or cleared strip running across the landscape, filled with activity. Before stones like you, the final layer of the road surface, could be placed, an enormous amount of work had to happen underneath. Roman roads were not simple affairs. They were engineered structures, built up from multiple layers, specifically designed for durability and drainage. This foundational work was crucial, often involving more material and effort than the visible paving stones on top. It was the hidden bulk of the road, its real strength. The first step would have been excavating the roadbed. A trench was dug to the required width and depth. This involved clearing the ground, removing soil, roots, and any obstacles. It had to be leveled and prepared. Then came the lower layers. The very bottom layer, often called the statumen, was a bed of large, flat stones, or sometimes rubble, laid down as a foundation. These stones were typically larger and less work than you, just substantial pieces of rock placed to provide a stable base and, importantly, help with drainage. This layer was crucial because it prevented the road from sinking into soft ground and allowed water to drain away, preventing frost damage in colder climates. Above the statumen came the next layer, often called the rudis. This was a layer of coarse aggregate, essentially gravel or broken stones mixed with lime or clay, compacted tightly. This layer provided bulk and stability. Imagine mixing concrete, but with rougher materials and compacted manually. It was a dense, solid layer designed to support the weight of the upper layers and the traffic. Sometimes there was a third layer, the nucleus, above the rudis. This was a finer aggregate, a mix of gravel and sand, again compacted, creating a smoother, denser bed for the final paving stones. This layer helped distribute the load evenly and provided a stable surface for laying the pavimentum. So, as you lay there near the edge of the construction, waiting your turn, you would have seen this process in action. Gangs of laborers, soldiers, enslaved people, or paid workers, digging, hauling, spreading material, and most importantly, compacting it. Compaction was key to Roman road building. They didn't have steamrollers, so they used heavy wooden or stone rammers, pounding the layers repeatedly until they were incredibly dense and firm. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of ramming was probably constant, a rhythmic beat accompanying the construction. This is a mainstream historical fact. The rigorous compaction of multiple layers was a hallmark of Roman road engineering and a major factor in their remarkable longevity. The sheer volume of material required for these foundational layers was immense. Kilometer after kilometer of roadbed needed to be filled with tons of stone, gravel, and sand. The carts you arrived on were just one part of a continuous supply chain. Other carts would be bringing smaller stones, gravel from riverbeds, sand, or lime. The construction site was busy and noisy. There were shouts of instruction, the rhythmic thudding of ramming, the scraping of shovels, the sounds of hammers, and the general murmur of many people working together. There would have been supervisors overseeing the work, ensuring the layers were of the correct thickness and properly compacted. The roadbed might have been slightly curved in the center, Cambridge, to aid drainage, a subtle but important detail of Roman engineering. A quirky or fringe tidbit, the Roman author Vitruvius, in his architectural treatise De Architectura, describes the ideal Roman road construction method, detailing the layers and materials. While archaeology has shown regional variations existed, Vitruvius's description gives us a fascinating glimpse into the theoretical standards and practices considered important by the Romans. It's like having the Roman equivalent of a highway construction manual. Historians still argue whether the precise specifications given by ancient writers like Vitruvius were strictly adhered to in practice everywhere across the vast empire, or if they represented an ideal that was often adapted based on local conditions, available resources, and the specific purpose of the road. It's likely a mix of both, a general standard applied with regional flexibility. Your road, built in a particular location with specific geological resources nearby, might have followed the general principles but used slightly different materials or layer thicknesses than a road built across the Alps or in North Africa. As you waited, you were exposed to the elements again. The sun would have beaten down, heating your surface. Rain might have turned the construction site into a muddy mess, perhaps slowing down the work, but the lower layers, designed for drainage, would have helped the site recover relatively quickly. You were just one piece of stone, but you were part of a massive, ongoing effort to create a permanent link across the landscape. The construction of a Roman road was a monumental undertaking, requiring immense resources, labor, and planning. It wasn't something that happened overnight. Building even a short section could take weeks or months, depending on the terrain, the number of workers, and the efficiency of the supply lines. As you lay there, you were witnessing the slow, methodical assembly of this incredible structure, layer by layer, compaction by compaction. You saw the completed lower layers stretching out, a solid, gray, man-made surface contrasting with the surrounding natural ground. It looked sturdy, immutable. It was a testament to the Roman obsession with permanence and practicality. This wasn't just a path, it was an infrastructure project designed to last for centuries. Your time was approaching. The foundational layers were being prepared, creating the bed upon which you and thousands of other shaped stones would be placed. You were the final piece of the puzzle, the visible surface that would interact directly with the traffic of the Roman world. The deep, hidden work was nearing completion. The stage was being set for your moment in the sun, or the rain, or whatever weather the Roman sky decided to throw at you. You were about to be lifted again, not for transport, but for final placement, for becoming a fixed, immovable part of this enduring structure. Your days of being moved around like cargo were almost over. You had waited, a shaped stone among many, while the deep, solid foundation of the Roman road was meticulously built up beneath you. You witnessed the statumen laid, those large, irregular base stones. You saw the rootus and the nucleus spread and pounded into rock-hard layers. The construction site was a hive of activity, a long scar across the landscape being systematically filled and compacted. Now, the ground beneath where the final surface would go was ready. It was your turn. You were picked up again. The hands were likely skilled now, belonging to the lapidarii or other workers tasked with the final paving. They weren't just tossing you, they were examining you, checking your shape, your size, and deciding where you might fit best. You were carried, perhaps a short distance, to the edge of the section of roadbed that was ready for the final layer, the pavimentum. This was the layer you were made for. It was the visible surface of the road, the part that people and carts would actually interact with. The process involved carefully laying the shaped stones, like you, side by side to create a continuous, durable surface. This wasn't like laying modern square paving stones. Roman cobbles were often irregular polygons, and the skill was in fitting them together as tightly as possible, minimizing the gaps between them. The workers would start at one edge of the road and work their way across, or from the center ridge outwards. They would place a stone, perhaps tap it down firmly with a hammer, and then select the next stone, looking for one that would fit snugly against the first. It was like assembling a giant, heavy, irregular jigsaw puzzle, but one where the pieces needed a bit of persuasion with a hammer. You were placed down onto the prepared nucleus layer. It felt solid, firm beneath you, a welcome contrast to the unstable ground of the quarry or the bumpy floor of the cart. You were positioned carefully, rotated until one of your flatter faces was uppermost and another was resting securely on the compacted base. Then, perhaps, a hammer came down, not to break you, but to tap you into place, to settle you firmly into the layer below. This is where your unique shape came into play. Because you weren't a perfect rectangle, you had multiple potential neighbors. The skill of the pavers was in selecting and orienting stones to minimize voids. Sometimes, smaller stones or gravel might be used to fill particularly large gaps between the main cobbles, though ideally, the fit was tight enough to prevent significant movement. You were now surrounded by other stones, similarly shaped, similarly positioned. You were touching your neighbors on several sides, locked together in a collective embrace that provided strength and stability to the surface. You weren't an individual piece anymore, you were part of a larger, interconnected matrix. Your weight, and the weight of the traffic above, would be distributed across you and your neighbors, preventing any single stone from sinking or shifting too much. Think about the feeling of being locked into place. After being loose, moved, and shaped, you were finally being set down, intended to stay put. It was the culmination of your journey from deep earth to functional road surface. You were serving your purpose. A mainstream historical fact about Roman road construction is that the pavimentum layer was typically laid in a slightly curved fashion, higher in the center and sloping down towards the sides. This Cambridge was designed to ensure that rainwater would run off the surface into ditches alongside the road, preventing water from soaking into the roadbed and undermining its structure. This simple, practical design feature was crucial for the longevity of the road, especially in regions with significant rainfall. As you were settled into your position, you would have heard the sounds of other stones being laid, the tapping of hammers, the chatter of workers. The road surface was growing, stone by stone, meter by meter. It was a process of careful, methodical construction, laying the final pieces of this impressive structure. A quirky or fringed tidbit related to the paving: some Roman road sections, particularly closer to urban centers or on major routes, occasionally feature stones with inscriptions or markings. These might be mile markers, though mile markers were often separate pillars, boundary markers, or even dedications. While humble stone like you was unlikely to be inscribed, the fact that some stones on the road surface carried information is a fascinating detail about how the Romans integrated communication and measurement into their infrastructure. Imagine if you had a little label on you stating your geological origin or the date you were laid. Historians still argue whether the use of specific stone types for the pavimentum layer was purely based on local availability and hardness, or if aesthetic considerations, such as color or texture, sometimes played a role, especially for prestigious roads entering cities. For a functional road built across the countryside, durability and ease of shaping from local rock were likely the main factors guiding your selection and placement. You were set. You were now a fixed point in the landscape, part of a growing, solid line stretching towards the horizon. You felt the weight of your neighbors pressing against you, the firm support of the layers below. You were no longer just a piece of rock, you were a Roman roadstone, one small, essential component of an engineering marvel. The gaps between the pavimentum stones were sometimes filled with smaller stones or a form of mortar or grout to help bind them together and provide a more even surface, although often the stones were simply packed tightly and relied on friction and the weight of traffic to settle into place. As you were laid, you might have felt finer material being swept or packed into the spaces around you, helping to lock you in even more securely. Your surface, which would soon be the top of the road, was still rough, bearing the marks of the shaping hammers. It wasn't polished or smooth, it was practical. It was designed to provide grip for feet and wheels, to withstand constant abrasion, not to be walked on barefoot. You were ready for action, ready to endure the countless journeys that would pass over you. As the section of road was completed around you, the sounds of construction might shift slightly. The focus might move to the next section, or to finishing the ditches alongside the road. You, however, were finished with your active transformation. You were set, in place, part of the final structure. You were no longer a raw material, or material in transit, or even material being shaped. You were a fixed element of the Roman world, waiting for the first signs of traffic to begin your long, active life as a surface stone. You were set. Firmly nestled amongst your neighbors in the finished pavimentum layer, locked into the solid embrace of the roadbed beneath. The frantic energy of the construction around your immediate position had subsided. The tapping of hammers on stone, the shouts of pavers, the scrape of tools, these sounds moved down the road as the workers progressed, leaving behind a completed surface. The raw, exposed earth around the roadbed might have been tidied, perhaps ditches dug alongside to channel water away, completing the necessary features of the road. You lay there, a finished product. Your rough surface, the result of your shaping in the quarry, faced upwards towards the sky. The sun, when it was out, beat down on you, warming your stone body. Rain fell and ran across you, quickly draining off the cambered surface towards the edges. You were no longer just a potential roadstone, you were a roadstone, waiting. The waiting wasn't long. Roman roads weren't built just to sit there empty, they were built to be used, immediately and constantly. Soon, you began to feel something new, something that had been absent during your millennia underground, your time in the quarry, your bumpy transport, and even the hustle of construction. You felt pressure. Localized, rhythmic pressure from above. The first sensation might have been faint, a distant vibration through the ground. Then it got closer, more distinct. A light, springy pressure, then lifting, then pressure again. Step, lift, step. It was the unmistakable pattern of human feet. The first footsteps fell upon you. A light, quick pressure, perhaps from a sandal or a bare foot. You felt the momentary indentation of the sole, or lack thereof, the shift of weight, and then it was gone, only for another footstep to land on you seconds later, or perhaps on a stone next to you. It was an entirely new sensation, this intermittent pressure on your upper surface. After the constant, immense pressure of being buried deep, or the sharp, violent impacts of hammers, this was something different, a dynamic, fleeting load. Then came heavier footsteps. The distinct, firm tread of hobnailed boots, the standard footwear of the Roman military. Clomp, clomp, clomp. These impacts were heavier, more deliberate. You felt the slight grinding as the hobnails scraped against your rough surface. This sound, the rhythmic march of legionaries, would become one of the defining soundscapes of your existence. Entire units would pass over you, hundreds, thousands of feet, day after day. It's enough to make your head spin, if you had a head. Imagine trying to keep count, impossible. Next came the wheels. A heavier, rolling pressure, accompanied by the rumble of wooden wheels and the jingle of harnesses. Carts, wagons, chariots, the wheeled traffic of the Roman world. The weight was often significant, especially for loaded carts carrying goods. You felt the concentrated pressure as the wheel rolled directly over you, a sensation quite different from a footstep. It was a deeper, more sustained force, pushing you down against the layers beneath. And the sound. The creak of the axle, the rumble of the wooden wheel on stone, the occasional clatter if the wheel hit a particularly uneven spot, not on you, of course, you were perfectly placed. It was a constant soundtrack of travel and commerce. And the animals. The steady thud-thud of hooves, horses pulling chariots or carts, mules laden with packs, oxen plodding along with heavy wagons. You felt the impact of the hooves, sharp and distinct, often accompanied by the softer sounds of snorting, neighing, or the jingle of bells and tack. And yes, where there are animals, there is, well, let's just say the occasional unpleasant deposit might have graced your surface. It was the reality of a living, breathing road. A mainstream historical fact, Roman roads, especially the major vie publici funded by the state, were incredibly busy arteries of communication and commerce. They facilitated the rapid movement of troops and information via the cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, enabled trade across vast distances, and connected cities and provinces throughout the empire. The traffic wasn't just local, it was empire-wide. The road was open. Your quiet anticipation was replaced by constant, vibrant activity. From dawn until dusk, and sometimes even into the night, travel by night was riskier but happened. You were subject to the passage of the Roman world. Feet, hooves, wheels, a never-ending stream of contact. You felt the vibrations ripple through your body, the subtle shift and settling as the weight bore down. You heard the cacophony of sounds, voices speaking Latin, and perhaps a dozen other languages, animal calls, the rhythmic creak and rumble of traffic. It was a symphony of movement, played out across your stony surface. It was a stark contrast to your prior existence. You had spent millions of years in silent, dark stillness. Your journey to the surface and placement had been noisy, but relatively brief. Now, silence was a rare visitor. Even when the main flow of traffic lessened, there might be a lone traveler, a shepherd guiding his flock, or the distant rumble of approaching wheels. You were part of a constant flow. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the opening of roads, While major new roads might have involved some form of official dedication or ceremony, it's likely that many stretches of road were simply open to traffic as soon as a usable section was completed, with little fanfare. For a humble stone like you, your grand opening was probably just the moment the first foot or will happen to pass over you after you were laid. No ribbons, no speeches, just use. Historians still argue whether the primary drivers for building new roads were military strategy, administrative control, or the economic benefits of trade. The answer is likely a complex interplay of these factors, varying depending on the specific road and the time period. But regardless of the high-level motivation, the result was the same for you, a constant stream of diverse traffic passing over your surface. You felt the changing pressures. The light tap of a child's foot, the heavy tread of a soldier laden with pack and armor, the concentrated weight of a single wheel bearing down. Each passage left a fleeting impression, a momentary stress on your structure. You were built to endure this. Your density, your hardness, the way you were locked into place with your neighbors and the solid foundation beneath, it was all designed for this constant, abrasive interaction. Over time, you would become familiar with the different rhythms of the road. The early morning rush of people heading to the fields or markets, the midday heat when traffic might slacken, unless you were in a particularly busy area, the evening return home. The passage of official vehicles with their distinctive speed and markings. The slow, heavy progress of ox carts. The rapid, sometimes dangerous, passage of chariots. You were like the ultimate passive observer. You saw, or felt, everyone, but interacted with no one, beyond bearing their weight. Emperors might have ridden in litters or carriages over you, soldiers marching to defend or expand the empire, merchants transporting goods, pilgrims heading to sacred sites. Everyday people simply going about their lives. You were the unsung platform for all of it. It's almost like being a fly on the wall, except you're flat on the floor and made of rock. Slightly less glamorous, perhaps. Your first few days and weeks were a period of settling in. The stones around you might have shifted slightly under the initial traffic, settling more firmly into the nucleus layer. The fine material between you might have been pressed down. You were becoming a truly integrated part of the road surface. The raw edges left by the shaping hammers were starting their slow process of being worn down by the constant abrasion of feet and wheels. This process of wear was inevitable, a slow but relentless transformation that began the moment the road was opened. You were now in your active service life, a life defined by bearing the weight of the Roman world. The road was alive with motion. Day after day, season after season, the flow over your surface was relentless. You became intimately familiar with the rhythms of Roman life, experienced not through sight or sound in the human sense, but through the pressures and vibrations transmitted through your stone body. You felt the light, rapid steps of messengers or runners, a quick, staccato beat passing over you. You felt the steady, measured tread of farmers heading to their fields outside the city, their steps perhaps heavier at the end of the day when they returned, tired from labor. You felt the hurried, perhaps anxious, steps of someone late for an appointment. You felt the playful scuffing of children's sandals as they ran along the edge of the road. Each type of footstep had a slightly different weight, a different cadence, a different way it interacted with your rough surface. Then there were the animals. The sharp, precise impact of horse hooves, sometimes shod with iron, sometimes bare. The heavier, more deliberate tread of oxen or donkeys. You could often tell what kind of animal was passing just by the feel of its steps. You felt the slight flex of the animal's muscles transferred through its hooves, the momentary grip on your stone. And accompanying the hooves were the wheels they pulled. The low, continuous rumble of a heavy cart, the lighter, quicker spin of a chariot wheel. The squeak of unoiled axles, a frequent, irritating sound on Roman roads. The rattle of cargo within the cart. The variety of traffic was immense. Soldiers on the march, their hobnailed boots a constant, percussive rhythm. Merchants with pack animals or carts laden with goods, amphorae of wine or olive oil, bales of cloth, sacks of grain, perhaps even exotic items from far-flung corners of the empire. Officials on inspection tours. Travelers on journeys for business or pleasure. Pilgrims heading to temples or shrines. Criminals being transported under guard. Even the occasional emperor or high-ranking dignitary in a comfortable carriage, relatively comfortable, anyway, for a ride over stones. You were the ground beneath them all. You felt the changing weight. A single pedestrian was one thing. A fully laden ox cart was another, placing a concentrated, heavy load on you as its wheel rolled over. You felt the solid layers beneath you providing support, preventing you from being crushed or pushed down too far. The interlocking fit with your neighbors was also crucial, distributing the weight and preventing individual stones from rocking or coming loose. This collective strength was key to the road's durability. The sensory environment around you, if you could process it, was a constant mix. The sounds of traffic, footsteps, hooves, wheels, voices, animal calls, harness jingles, whip cracks. The smells, dust, animal sweat and waste, the faint aroma of goods being transported, wine, spices, leather, the smell of rain on hot stone. The feel, the changing temperature of your surface, the wetness of rain, the drying effect of sun and wind, the constant abrasion of movement. A quirky tidbit about daily life on Roman roads. Because travel could be slow and tiring, roadside inns and taverns, Capponi or Taberni, sprang up at intervals along the major routes. These offered food, drink, and sometimes rudimentary lodging for travelers, forming a vital part of the road ecosystem. While you couldn't experience the hospitality inside, you would have been right outside, feeling the feet and wheels of those stopping for refreshment or rest. Imagine the conversations happening just meters above you. A mainstream historical fact, the Roman road network was vast, estimated to be over 400,000 kilometers, about 250,000 miles, in total length across the empire, with over 80,000 kilometers, 50,000 miles, of paved roads like the one you were part of. This extensive network was unparalleled in the ancient world and remained the backbone of infrastructure in many areas for centuries, a testament to its quality and the Roman commitment to connectivity. Historians still argue whether the Roman road network was primarily built for military control and expansion, allowing legions to move quickly to suppress rebellions or conquer new territory, or if its main impact was economic, facilitating trade and the movement of goods and people, leading to greater prosperity and integration across the empire. It's likely a complex balance, with military needs often providing the initial impetus for construction, but the economic benefits becoming increasingly significant over time. Through all this activity, you remained in place, serving your function. You were the stable platform upon which this constant stream of life flowed. You endured the weight, the abrasion, the dirt, the waste. You were trod upon by rich and poor, soldier and civilian, human and animal. You were a silent, passive witness to the daily grind and grand movements of the Roman world. The constant passage of traffic, while the purpose of your existence, was also the beginning of your slow decline. Each footstep, each hoofbeat, each turn of a wheel, caused tiny amounts of wear and abrasion on your surface. The rough edges left by your shaping were slowly, imperceptibly being ground down. Dust and grit, carried by the wind or tracked onto the road, acted like sandpaper, contributing to the wear. Rain, while draining off the surface, could still carry abrasive particles. It was a slow, relentless process, like watching paint dry, but over centuries. You were, very gradually, being smoothed and worn down by the very life that passed over you. It's almost ironic, isn't it? Your purpose was to be used, but that use inevitably led to your gradual erosion. A bit like me staying up late writing this script. You were now a veteran of the road. You had experienced the initial settling, the novelty of constant contact, and the beginning of your long life under traffic. You were no longer just a stone. You were a functioning part of the Roman infrastructure, a tiny, anonymous piece bearing the weight of an empire's daily life. Your existence was defined by the countless feet, hooves, and wheels that rolled over you, day in and day out, year after year. Your life on the surface of the Roman road was defined by constant interaction, the weight, the abrasion, the noise of the traffic. But it was also shaped by forces far larger and more indifferent than human activity, the elements. You were exposed now, after millennia of subterranean stability, to the whims of the weather. The sun was a powerful presence. In the daytime, especially in summer, it would beat down on you, heating your surface significantly. You would absorb that warmth, radiating it back into the air. Imagine the difference between your cool, dark birth chamber deep underground and the blazing heat of a summer day on the surface. Quite a change in real estate, wouldn't you say? This constant heating and cooling cycle caused tiny expansions and contractions within your stone structure. Over time, this thermal stress, combined with other factors, could contribute to surface cracking or flaking. Rain was a frequent visitor. When it rained, your surface would become wet and slick, changing the grip for feet and wheels. The water would initially pool slightly on your rough surface before flowing down the gentle camber towards the roadside ditches. While the Roman engineering was designed to handle this drainage, heavy or prolonged rain could still challenge the system. You felt the cool splash of raindrops, the sensation of being completely saturated. Water could seep into any tiny cracks on your surface or into the narrow gaps between you and your neighbors. Perhaps the most insidious effect of water came with freezing temperatures. If water seeped into cracks or crevices within or around you and then froze, it would expand. This ice expansion, year after year in colder climates, could exert significant pressure, slowly widening cracks, loosening the bond between stones, and potentially even causing the surface to buckle or heave. This freeze-thaw cycle is a major factor in the deterioration of paved surfaces even today, and the Romans, while skilled, weren't immune to its effects, although their robust foundation layers helped mitigate the damage compared to less well-built roads. Wind also played a role. It could sweep across your surface, carrying dust, grit, and debris, contributing to the abrasive wear. It could also help dry you out after rain, preventing water from lingering too long on the surface or in the joints. Strong winds might carry larger debris, like leaves or twigs, which would eventually be crushed or blown away, but for a brief time might rest upon you. Over seasons, you experienced the full cycle of weather. The warmth of summer, the soaking rains of autumn, the freezing cold and perhaps snow of winter, the thawing and new growth of spring. Each season brought different conditions, different stresses, different interactions with your stone form. A quirky tidbit: while Roman engineering was impressive, they didn't have access to modern weather forecasting or material science in the same way. Their understanding of how materials would behave under different environmental stresses was empirical, learned through centuries of trial and error. The materials and techniques used in Roman roads evolved over time as they learned what worked best in different climates and terrains. You also endured organic intrusions. Tiny plants, moss, lichen, weeds, would attempt to take root in the soil and debris that accumulated in the small gaps between you and your neighbors. Their roots, though small, could exert surprising pressure as they grew, slowly widening the joints. You felt the subtle encroachment of these organic forces, a slow challenge to the neat, engineered order of the road surface. A mainstream historical fact: the Roman road network required constant maintenance to remain functional. Despite their durable construction, segments would wear down, stones would come loose, and drainage ditches would need clearing. Responsibility for maintenance often fell to local communities, landowners, or military units stationed nearby. This ongoing effort was essential to keeping the empire's arteries open, although the quality and frequency of maintenance likely varied greatly across time and region. Historians still argue whether the decline and maintenance of the Roman road network in later centuries was a cause or a symptom of the wider decline of the Western Roman Empire. Did the roads fall into disrepair because the central authority and resources needed for maintenance weakened? Or did the inability to effectively use the roads contribute to the empire's fragmentation and economic difficulties? It's a classic chicken and egg historical question. You were part of a structure that was constantly being acted upon by both human use and natural forces. The steady grind of traffic wore you down from above, while the elements, sun, rain, frost, wind, worked on your surface and in the spaces around you. You were slowly, inexorably being eroded, weathered, and potentially loosened. Each tiny grain of dust that blew across you, each drop of rain that fell, each cycle of freezing and thawing, added to the cumulative effect of millions of such events over centuries. You were subtly changing. Your surface was becoming smoother where it was constantly rubbed by traffic, perhaps showing tiny cracks or pitting in areas of particular stress or exposure. The edges where you met your neighbors might have been worn down, slightly widening the gaps. You were not an eternal, unchanging monument. You were a piece of rock engaged in a very, very slow process of disintegration, a return to the raw materials you once were, driven by the forces of nature and the constant demands of human use. It was a humbling thought, if rocks could feel humble. Despite the immense engineering effort that put you here and kept you functional, you were still subject to the fundamental processes that wear away mountains over eons. You endured it all. The scorching sun, the chilling rain, the biting wind, the slow creep of plant life. These were the background conditions of your life on the surface, a constant, passive exposure that added another layer to the story of your existence on the Roman road. You were not just a platform for traffic, you were a piece of the natural world, placed in an artificial context, and still subject to the powerful, slow forces of the environment. You were bearing the weight of the Roman world, enduring the sun and the rain, the subtle stresses of the elements. But the feet and wheels that passed over you weren't just random occurrences. They were the manifestation of human history, unfolding directly on your surface. You, a simple stone, were an unwitting stage for the grand and the mundane events of an empire. You felt the rhythmic clomp, clomp, clomp that was the heartbeat of Roman power, the marching legions. Not just small detachments, but sometimes entire armies, thousands of heavily armed men, their hobnailed boots pounding down on you, their supply wagons rumbling behind them. You felt the concentrated, powerful weight of their passage, mile after mile, day after day, as they moved to quell a rebellion, embark on a conquest, or simply shift their garrisons. You were the solid ground beneath campaigns that shaped the map of the ancient world. A mainstream historical fact, the speed at which Roman legions could move along the well-maintained road network was a significant military advantage, allowing them to respond rapidly to threats or concentrate forces effectively across vast distances. You might have felt the difference in their passage depending on the circumstances. The confident, steady march of troops on parade or routine movement. The hurried, perhaps irregular tread of soldiers on forced march to an emergency. The heavy, weary shuffle of troops returning from a long campaign. You felt the subtle shifts in rhythm and pressure that spoke volumes about the human condition above you, though you had no way to interpret them. Then came the important people. You might not have seen their faces, but you felt their presence through the weight of their entourage. The heavy, springing suspension, what little there was, of a comfortable carriage, pulled by well-fed horses, surrounded by the quicker steps of outriders and guards. This could be a provincial governor on inspection, a wealthy senator traveling to his estates, or even, on occasion, the emperor himself, or a member of his imperial family. While not a daily occurrence for most roadstones, the passage of imperial figures transformed a section of road into a momentary, moving center of power. You felt the weight of authority, literally, passing over you. Imagine being that stone, the one the emperor's chariot will rolled over. Though, From your perspective, it was just another heavy wheel. You also bore the passage of ideas, not just people and goods. Traders brought not only physical items but also news, rumors, different perspectives from distant lands. Travelers shared stories. Soldiers returning home spread tales of their experiences. Later in the empire's history, you might have felt the sandals of early Christians traveling to spread their faith, or the passage of scholars and philosophers journeying to centers of learning. The roads were arteries for the movement of culture and information just as much as they were for troops and commerce. A quirky or fringe tidbit that relates to the lives of people on these roads, travelers, soldiers, and even laborers working on or near the roads often left their mark, sometimes literally. We find evidence of simple graffiti scratched onto stones near the road edge, or even painted on adjacent walls or rocks, names, dates, simple messages, crude drawings. While you, as a road surface stone, were probably too exposed and constantly trafficked for graffiti to last on you, you might have been the solid ground beneath someone who paused, knelt, and scratched their name into a stone just beside you, leaving a tiny, personal mark on the landscape that would outlast their own fleeting life. You felt the ground tremble slightly with their presence. Historians still argue whether the Roman road network's most significant impact was its role in facilitating military control and expansion, effectively binding the disparate parts of the empire together under central authority, or if its greatest legacy was its long-term stimulus to trade, economic integration, and the cultural exchange that resulted from increased travel and connectivity across the Mediterranean world and beyond. It's a debate that highlights the multifaceted nature of Roman infrastructure and its profound effects. You bore the weight of ordinary lives, too, far more frequently than emperors or armies. The farmer's donkey laden with produce, the potter carrying his wares to market, the family migrating to a new town seeking opportunity, the beggar seeking alms, the priest going to perform a ritual. You felt the mundane reality of daily life for millions of people across centuries. Their hopes, their struggles, their simple journeys, they all passed directly over you. You were a constant in a world of change. Empires rose and fell, dynasties changed, religions spread, languages evolved, but you remained there, a piece of stone in the road, serving your function. You witnessed the passage of time not in years or decades, but in the slow wearing away of your surface, the deepening of ruts, if they formed, the subtle shifts in the flow and type of traffic. You felt the subtle anxiety of travelers on a lonely stretch of road, perhaps hurrying their pace as dusk approached. You felt the celebratory energy of a group heading to a festival in the nearest town. You felt the weary slump of someone returning home after a long, difficult journey. All these human emotions, these countless individual stories, were played out on the stage of your existence. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That a simple, inanimate object like a rock could be present for so much history, so much human drama. You didn't understand it, you didn't judge it, you didn't even really perceive it in a conscious way. You just bore the weight, endured the passage, and remained in place. You were the silent, stony witness to the flow of an empire's life, from its most powerful figures to its most humble citizens, all connected by the enduring ribbon of stone of which you were an essential, if anonymous, part. Your long life on the surface was just beginning to show its effects. The constant grinding, the exposure to the elements, the relentless weight, it was all taking its toll, slowly, subtly changing your form and your position within the road. The process of erosion had begun, and there was no stopping it. You had become accustomed to the endless stream of traffic, the feet, the hooves, the wheels. You had endured the sun, the rain, the wind, the frost. These forces, both human and natural, weren't just passing over you, they were actively, albeit slowly, changing you. The process of erosion had begun the moment you were laid, and over decades and centuries, its effects started to become noticeable, both on your individual form and on the road surface as a whole. Your rough surface, the one left by the shaping hammers in the quarry, was no longer as sharp or uneven. The constant friction from countless footsteps and rolling wheels had begun to smooth it down. Imagine being gently but persistently rubbed with sandpaper for hundreds of years. That's essentially what was happening to your exposed upper face. Tiny particles of your stone were being worn away, carried off by wind or rain, or ground into dust by the traffic. You were slowly losing mass, millimeter by millimeter over the generations. The edges where you met your neighbors were also subject to wear. As stones shifted minusculely under the weight of traffic, or as grit worked its way into the joints, these edges would rub against each other. They became rounded and less distinct. The tight fit you once had with your immediate neighbors might have loosened fractionally as wear occurred. This wear wasn't uniform. The parts of your surface that bore the most direct weight, perhaps along the common line of a wheel track, would wear down faster than areas that were less frequently stepped or rolled upon. This differential wear, over time, could contribute to the formation of shallow ruts in the road surface, following the most common paths of wheel traffic. You might feel yourself sitting slightly lower than some of your less trafficked neighbors as your upper surface was gradually ground away. Water, as we discussed, also played its part. Seeping into cracks, freezing and expanding in colder climates, this slowly worked to loosen the bond between stones and within the stones themselves. While the underlying layers were designed for drainage, constant exposure and wear on the surface could create new vulnerabilities. Over centuries, the cumulative effect of all these forces was significant. The road surface wasn't as perfect as the day it was laid. Some stones might have become loose, rocking slightly underfoot or wheel. The gaps between stones might have widened in places. The overall surface might not have been quite as smooth or evenly cambered as it was originally. A mainstream historical fact illustrating the effect of wear, archaeological excavations of Roman roads often reveal surfaces where the top layer of pavimentum stones is noticeably worn down, sometimes by several centimeters, particularly in areas of heavy traffic like gateways into towns or on major routes. This physical evidence is a direct testament to the centuries of use and the slow process of erosion you were experiencing. Think about the sound changing. As the surface wore and perhaps became less perfectly smooth, the sound of traffic might shift. The clean clop of hooves or the smooth rumble of wheels on a new surface might become more of a scrape, a rattle, or a bump as they passed over stones that were loose or worn unevenly. A quirky or fringe tidbit: there are historical accounts and archaeological findings that suggest Roman road repair methods were sometimes quite basic. Loose stones might simply be reset or new ones hammered into place. In later periods, layers of gravel or smaller stones might be dumped on top of a worn pavimentum surface to provide a temporary fix, rather than undertaking the extensive work of relaying the top layer properly. This highlights how maintenance practices could vary and weren't always up to the original high standard. Imagine having a bunch of gravel suddenly dumped on top of you. Annoying. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of Roman road deterioration was the sheer volume of traffic, the quality, or lack thereof, of ongoing maintenance, or the impact of environmental factors like climate change over the centuries. It was almost certainly a combination of all these things, but the relative importance of each factor likely varied greatly depending on the specific location, the road's purpose, and the time period. You, as a single stone, were just one tiny part of this large-scale process. You didn't choose to wear down, you didn't resist the erosion. You simply were, and the forces acting upon you gradually altered your form. You were becoming smoother, perhaps slightly smaller, your edges rounded. The marks of the quarry and the shaping hammers were slowly being erased, replaced by the marks of centuries of use. You were also part of the road's slow, subtle settling. The immense weight of the road structure itself, and the constant passage of heavy traffic, caused a gradual compaction and settlement of the underlying layers. You, as the top stone, would have settled along with them, perhaps sinking slightly over the decades, becoming even more firmly embedded in your bed. Your life had shifted from the dynamic chaos of construction to the steady, long-term grind of existence under traffic and the elements. You were no longer just a stone, or a newly laid stone. You were an old stone, bearing the physical marks of your history, a silent record of the countless journeys that had passed over you. You were subtly but surely changing, slowly returning to the dust from which, on a geological timescale, you originally came. Centuries had passed. The empire you served had reached its zenith, expanded its borders, and then, slowly, inexorably, began to decline. The constant, vibrant flow of life you had known on your surface started to change. It wasn't sudden, but gradual, a slow thinning of the stream. The legions still marched, but perhaps less frequently, or along different routes as the military situation shifted. Imperial officials still traveled, but maybe the network of administration wasn't as robust as it once was. Trade continued, but perhaps some routes became less secure, less frequented, as central authority weakened and local instability grew. You began to experience periods of quieter days, even stretches of time when the constant rumble of heavy traffic lessened significantly. The soundscape over your surface shifted. The steady clomp of coordinated marching might become rarer. The heavy creak of state-sponsored supply wagons might dwindle. You would still feel feet and hooves, the passage of local people, farmers, herders, travelers, but perhaps the intensity and volume of empire-wide traffic diminished. The nature of the traffic might also change. Less official, more local. Less military, more civilian. You might feel the lighter tread of people navigating a less secure world, perhaps traveling in smaller groups, or avoiding the roads altogether in favor of safer, less direct routes. This decline in traffic had implications for you and the road. While less abrasion might slow your personal wear and tear slightly, the decline in use often coincided with a decline in maintenance. Remember how the road needed constant repair? As the central government weakened, its ability and willingness to fund and organize widespread road maintenance diminished. Responsibility might have fallen more heavily on local populations, who might not have had the resources or the motivation to keep the vast network in pristine condition. The drainage ditches alongside you might become clogged with leaves, soil, and vegetation. This meant water wouldn't drain off the cambered surface as effectively, potentially standing on the road or seeping into the structure, accelerating its deterioration. The small gaps between you and your neighbors, widened slightly by centuries of wear, might collect more dirt and debris, allowing weeds and grass to take root more easily. Loose stones, which in earlier times would have been quickly reset, might remain loose, creating hazards and accelerating the wear on adjacent stones. Sections of the road might develop more pronounced ruts or areas of significant deterioration. You might feel yourself becoming less firmly supported as the layers beneath you, subject to water ingress and reduced compaction from lessened heavy traffic, started to lose some of their integrity. A mainstream historical fact illustrating the decline, documentary evidence and archaeological findings from the late Roman period and the centuries immediately following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, around 5th century CE, show a clear pattern of reduced road maintenance and a shift in traffic patterns. Many major Roman roads continued to be used, but their condition often deteriorated significantly from their peak, while some less crucial routes might have fallen into disuse more rapidly. The empire's troubles were manifesting physically on the ground you occupied. You felt the lessening pulse of its activity, the subtle signs of neglect taking hold. The proud, engineered structure you were part of was beginning its long, slow process of returning to nature, its dominance challenged by the forces of erosion and the diminishing effort of human upkeep. A quirky or fringe tidbit, during the period of decline and into the early Middle Ages, sections of abandoned or poorly maintained Roman roads were sometimes cannibalized. Their carefully shaped stones, like you, were a readily available source of building material for local structures, houses, churches, fortifications. So, some of your brethren might have been pried from their place in the road and found a new, albeit different, second life in a wall or a foundation. You, however, remained. Perhaps you were too well set, too remote, or simply overlooked. Historians still argue whether the decline and eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire was a sudden catastrophic event or a long, drawn-out process of transformation and decentralization. The state of the road network reflects this debate. It wasn't like someone flipped a switch and all the roads instantly crumbled. The decline was gradual, uneven, and varied by region, mirroring the broader changes in the empire itself. As the centuries of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages unfolded, the landscape around you changed too. Farms might have been abandoned, villages might have shrunk or disappeared. The familiar markers and signs along the road might have fallen down or become illegible. The world felt smaller, more localized, and the grand, unifying purpose of the road seemed less evident in the diminished traffic and growing signs of disrepair. You were still a roadstone, still fulfilling your basic function of providing a relatively firm surface. But the context had changed dramatically. The empire that built you and relied upon you so heavily was a shadow of its former self. The constant, purposeful energy of its peak had dissipated. You were now part of a structure that was transitioning from a vibrant, integral part of a functioning empire to a relic of a bygone era. You felt the grass and weeds pushing up more determinedly through the widening cracks between you and your neighbors. You saw, if you could see, the soil beginning to accumulate in the depressions on your surface and around your edges. The wild world was starting to reclaim the space that Roman engineering had so meticulously ordered. Your long, active life was slowly giving way to a period of neglect and, eventually, obscurity. The decline you had felt, the thinning traffic, the growing signs of neglect, continued. The world above you was moving on, adapting, forgetting the meticulous order of the empire that had built you. And as human attention waned, the patient, persistent forces of nature began their slow, inexorable work of reclaiming the landscape. The first signs were subtle. More leaves fell upon your surface in autumn and weren't swept away as diligently. They collected in the small depressions and widened gaps between you and your neighbors, decomposing and adding organic matter. Dust and fine soil, carried by the wind or washed down by rain from adjacent fields or slopes, began to settle on you and filter into every crevice. You felt the fine grit accumulating, a thin film at first, then thicker, covering your rough-hewn surface. Weeds and grass, which had always tried to gain a foothold in the cracks, now found more purchase. Their roots, thin at first, then thickening, pushed into the spaces between your edges and the stones beside you. They crept across your surface, finding purchase in tiny pits or irregularities. You felt the slow, insistent pressure of their growth, a quiet dismantling of the structure from within the joints. It's like having a tiny, green demolition crew working on your foundations, but very, very slowly. Rain continued to fall, but instead of running cleanly off the cambered surface and into regularly maintained ditches, it lingered. It soaked into the accumulating layers of soil and organic matter on the roadbed, carrying fine particles down, gradually blurring the lines between the stones and the environment around you. The drainage system, once so crucial, became choked, less effective. Over decades, then centuries, the layers built up. Each year's leaf fall, each dust storm, each deposit of sediment washed down by rain, added another thin film. The roots of plants spread, died, and added more organic matter, contributing to the soil formation. The ground level around and eventually over you began to rise, not dramatically, but inch by painstaking inch. The sounds changed. The distant rumble of wheels became muffled as the cushioning layer of soil thickened. The sharp clomp of hoofs faded into a duller impact. The chatter of voices became less distinct, eventually disappearing altogether as fewer and fewer people found cause to traverse this section of the decaying road. The constant, vibrant soundscape of the Roman era was replaced by the quieter sounds of nature, the rustle of wind through grass and weeds, the buzz of insects, the calls of birds, the drip of rain. You were sinking into silence. Light became a memory. As the layer of earth above you grew thicker, the sun's rays could no longer reach your surface. You returned to a state of darkness, not the deep, ancient darkness of your birth deep underground, but a shallower, more temporary darkness, buried just below the surface of a new world. You were enveloped in the cool, damp embrace of the soil, a familiar sensation after your time in the quarry face, but this time it felt different, less like a home, more like a shroud. You were no longer a roadstone in function, but you were still there, in place, a stubborn, resistant object within the accumulating earth. You were a ghost road, a memory preserved just beneath the new ground level. The shape of the roadbed, the alignment of the stones, the layers beneath you, they all remained, a hidden structure being swallowed by the natural landscape. A mainstream historical fact about the burial of Roman roads. Many sections of Roman roads that fell into disuse or were only minimally maintained became covered over by accumulating soil and vegetation over the centuries, effectively disappearing from the visible landscape. These lost roads are often rediscovered by archaeologists today, found buried just a few feet or even inches below the modern ground surface, remarkably preserved by the earth that covered them. The pressure on you changed again. Not the dynamic pressure of traffic, but the steady, gentle weight of the accumulating soil above you. It was nowhere near the immense pressure of the deep earth, but it was a constant, soft pressure that replaced the intermittent, heavy loads you had borne for so long. The organisms of the soil became your neighbors, worms, insects, fungi, bacteria, all working to process organic matter and churn the earth around you. Their activity, while microscopic from your perspective, was part of the slow, biological process that contributed to your burial. It's like having a million tiny roommates who constantly rearrange the furniture and leave little tunnels everywhere. A quirky or fringe tidbit, in some areas, the route of buried Roman roads can still be faintly discerned on the surface even today, visible as subtle differences in vegetation growth, soil type, or drainage patterns that reflect the underlying stone structure. Sometimes called crop marks when seen from the air, or subtle changes in soil moisture retention, these ephemeral traces are a ghostly echo of the lost road, hinting at your presence below. Historians still argue whether the precise routes of all Roman roads were meticulously planned and surveyed from the outset, or if some routes evolved from pre-existing tracks and were only later formalized and paved. This debate about planning versus organic development touches upon the nature of Roman control and infrastructure projects, and for you, buried beneath the earth, the method of your road's initial planning probably mattered little compared to the gradual, organic process of your reburial by nature. You were in a state of deep rest again, but different from your geological slumber. You were closer to the surface now, just below the realm of roots and burrowing animals. It was a quiet, dark existence, punctuated only by the slow creep of water through the soil, the pressure of roots, and the occasional vibration from something happening on the surface, a tree falling, perhaps, or later, the distant rumble of different kinds of machines you couldn't comprehend. You had been part of the vibrant, active Roman world for centuries. Now, you were part of the quiet, hidden history beneath the feet of people who might not even know you were there. You were a secret, preserved in the earth, waiting. Waiting in the dark, in the silence, a silent witness to a world long gone, your existence now a matter for the earthworms and the slow passage of groundwater. The time passed differently now. Not measured in the passage of traffic, but in the slow, steady accumulation of soil above you, the gradual deepening of your burial. 1 year bled into the next, 1 century into the next, in an unbroken stretch of darkness and silence. You were a geological feature again, subject to the slow processes of the earth, but with a history etched into your very being by the time you spent as a Roman roadstone. You had been resting in the quiet darkness for centuries. The world above had changed in ways you couldn't possibly comprehend. Kingdoms had risen and fallen, technologies had advanced, and the memory of the empire that built you had faded into books and ruins. You were just a lump in the ground, indistinguishable from any other buried stone to the casual eye, preserved by the patient accumulation of soil. Then, the silence was broken. Not by the familiar sounds of Roman traffic, or the quiet processes of nature, but by something entirely new. Vibrations, sharp and mechanical, penetrated the earth above you. A deep rumble, different from any cart or wagon you had known. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of unfamiliar engines. And then, closer, the scrape of metal against earth, the jingle of equipment, and human voices, speaking a language that was certainly not Latin, or Greek, or any of the tongues you'd heard on your surface centuries ago. The vibrations grew more insistent, the scraping closer. It was a deliberate process, different from the chaotic digging of the quarry or the purposeful construction of the road. This felt more careful. The ground above you was being disturbed, removed layer by layer, but with a certain precision. You felt the blade of a shovel, then perhaps the finer edge of a trowel, scraping away the soil that had been your blanket for so long. The darkness began to lessen. A faint gray light penetrated through the remaining soil. Then, a patch of brighter light, growing larger. Air reached you, cool and carrying strange scents you didn't recognize. You felt the delicate touch of brushes, sweeping away the last remnants of earth from your upper surface. And then, you were exposed. Fully, completely exposed to the sky and the air once more. The light was bright, harsh, unlike anything you had experienced since the last time the sun shone directly on your surface, centuries ago. The world you saw, if you could see, was utterly alien. Towering structures made of materials you didn't know existed, strange, fast-moving vehicles making odd noises on a paved surface that wasn't stone, humans dressed in brightly colored, unfamiliar clothes. You were being examined. Hands touched you again, but gently, carefully. Eyes peered closely at your surface, tracing your outlines, observing your shape and how you fit with your neighbors. There were murmurs of excitement, technical terms you couldn't grasp. You were being studied, analyzed. You weren't just a forgotten stone anymore, you were an object of interest, a clue. You had been rediscovered. You were part of a buried Roman road, unearthed by people trying to understand the past. These were archaeologists, historians of the ground. They had likely found hints of the road's presence, perhaps those subtle changes in vegetation, or a mention in an ancient map, or simply searching in an area where a major Roman route was known to have passed. And here you were, along with your brethren, waiting patiently beneath the earth. A mainstream historical fact that makes this moment possible, archaeological excavation is the primary method by which we locate and study many features of the Roman world, including large sections of their road network that have been buried by centuries of soil accumulation. Digging up these buried roads allows us to verify ancient accounts, study construction techniques firsthand, and understand the network's extent and characteristics. The archaeologists would be meticulously documenting their find. They would measure your position, perhaps photograph you and the surrounding stones. They might carefully clean your surface to better see its features, the wear patterns from ancient traffic, the marks of the shaping hammers, perhaps even evidence of repairs or modifications. You were being recorded, your quiet centuries of burial ending with a flurry of scientific activity. A quirky or fringe tidbit from archaeology. Sometimes, when excavating Roman roads, archaeologists find small objects lost by travelers centuries ago, coins, pieces of pottery, belt buckles, or even discarded tools from road workers. While you, the stone, are the main event of the road itself, these small, personal items found lying on or embedded in the road surface provide fascinating glimpses into the lives of the people who used you every day. Imagine a soldier dropping a coin right on your surface all those centuries ago, and it stayed there, buried with you until now. Historians still argue whether the precise methodologies described by ancient writers like Vitruvius for Roman road construction were followed universally, or if there was significant regional variation in practice. Excavating different sections of road, like the one you were part of, provides crucial evidence to inform this debate, allowing scholars to compare the theoretical descriptions with the actual construction methods used in different parts of the empire. Your very existence and composition offer data points for this ongoing discussion. You felt the sun again, a strange sensation after so long in the dark. You felt the air moving over you, different from the humid stillness of the buried earth. You heard voices discussing your age, your origin, the empire you had served. You were no longer just a passive element of the earth, you were an artifact, a piece of history brought back to the light. Your time of quiet burial was over. You had been rediscovered, exposed to a world far removed from the one you had known. Your purpose as a roadstone was long past, but you had a new purpose now, to tell a story, to provide evidence, to connect the present to the distant past. You were a tangible link to the Roman world, a piece of its infrastructure surviving the rise and fall of empires, waiting patiently beneath the earth until someone came looking. Your journey wasn't over, even though you were no longer a functional road. You had moved from deep earth to surface, from busy road to buried relic, and now, to excavated artifact. What would happen to you next? Would you remain in place, preserved in situ as part of an archaeological site? Or would you be moved again, taken to a museum, perhaps, to be studied and displayed? Your long, quiet waiting was over, replaced by a brief period of intense scrutiny and a new uncertainty about your final resting place in this strange, new world. You had been brought back to the light, exposed after centuries of quiet burial. The strange creatures who called themselves humans were studying you and the road you were part of. Your period of dark, silent waiting was over. Now came the question of your final destination in this bewildering modern world. Perhaps you were deemed important enough, or your section of road significant enough, to be preserved in situ. This means you would remain where you were found, still part of the ancient roadbed, but now protected, perhaps covered again temporarily, or displayed as part of an archaeological park or visitor site. Your surroundings would be different from the working road you once knew. There might be fences, information signs, explaining your history to these new humans, and designated walkways for people to observe you without stepping on you anymore. You would be a static exhibit, a piece of the past literally embedded in the present landscape. You'd feel the distant vibrations of modern life, cars on nearby roads, maybe even the hum of machinery, but the direct contact of feet and wheels would be a rare, controlled event. You would experience weather again, sun, rain, perhaps even snow, much like you did in your active service, but your purpose would have fundamentally shifted from function to education, from being used to being shown. Or, perhaps you were chosen for a different fate. You might have been carefully lifted from your millennia-old bed, separated from your neighbors. This would have been done with care, unlike the violent extraction from the quarry or the rough handling onto the cart. Tools designed for preservation, not destruction, would have been used. You might have been cleaned gently, perhaps even taken to a laboratory to be examined more closely, measured, photographed, perhaps even subjected to scientific tests to determine your precise geological origin or the residues left on your surface. If you were moved, your final resting place might be indoors, a museum display case, a storage facility for archaeological artifacts, or perhaps a research collection. Imagine the shock. After millions of years underground, centuries on a road surface exposed to the sky, and more centuries buried in the earth, you would suddenly find yourself under artificial lights, in a climate-controlled room, surrounded by other objects of the past. No more rain, no more sun, no more dust from passing carts. Just quiet stillness, punctuated by the hushed footsteps and murmuring voices of museum visitors or researchers. You might be displayed alongside other artifacts from the Roman world, pottery shards, coins, tools, pieces of sculpture. You, a humble roach stone, would be placed in a context designed to tell the story of the people who made and used you. You would be a tangible link to the Roman engineering prowess, a physical example of the material culture of their infrastructure. People would stand before you, reading a label that explained your history, marveling, perhaps briefly, at your longevity and the journey you represent. It's quite a career change, from functional ground to museum piece, wouldn't you agree? From being stepped on to being looked at. Think about the sheer contrast. You, a piece of rock formed by geological forces over immense timescales, wrenched from the earth by beings whose entire civilization lasted only a fraction of your existence, shaped by their simple tools, placed in their enduring structure, buried by the slow march of nature, and finally unearthed by their distant descendants using complex machinery and methods. Your journey encompasses scales of time and human history that are almost impossible for us to grasp fully. A mainstream historical fact that underpins this, Roman road-building techniques, while varying regionally, shared core principles of layered construction and robust materials like stone, which is why remnants of their roads, including paving stones like you, have survived for 2 millennia and can still be studied by modern archaeologists. This physical evidence is invaluable for understanding the practical realities of Roman engineering and labor. In your modern resting place, whether in situ or indoors, you would be surrounded by a world that is unimaginably different from the one you knew. The smells, the sounds, the sights, everything would be alien. The sheer speed of modern life, the complexity of technology, the global scale of interaction, it would be a bewildering tableau for a simple stone whose frame of reference is feet, hooves, and wooden wheels. It's enough to make a rock feel like it's had too much caffeine. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Roman materials, sometimes, analysis of the materials used in Roman roads and buildings, including the specific minerals and stones like you, can provide clues about trade routes and economic connections, especially if the stone was transported from a distant quarry. Your very composition, examined under modern scientific equipment, might hold secrets about the logistical networks of the empire that laid you down. Historians still argue about the extent to which Roman engineering knowledge was lost or preserved during the post-Roman period and the Middle Ages. The rediscovery and study of structures like Roman roads provide tangible evidence of their sophisticated techniques, allowing modern scholars to better understand the level of technical expertise that existed in the ancient world and how it compares to later periods. Your existence contributes data to this ongoing scholarly discussion about the continuity or rupture of knowledge. As you sit in your modern setting, perhaps you feel the subtle vibrations of a distant train, or the hum of electricity, or the soft footsteps of a museum visitor. These are the echoes of a world you didn't build, a world that came long after yours had passed its peak. Yet, you are a part of its story. You are a link, a piece of tangible history that helps these modern humans understand their own past. Your job as a functional roadstone is over. You will no longer bear the weight of emperors, armies, or daily commerce. You will no longer feel the slow abrasion of sandals, hooves, and wheels. You will no longer endure the open sky, the driving rain, or the freezing frost. Your physical journey, which began deep within the earth and brought you through epochs of geological change, human industry, imperial life, and quiet burial, has led you to this final, static place in the modern world. You are a testament to patience, to durability, to the slow persistence of geological forces, and the enduring impact of human endeavor. You are a simple rock with an extraordinary, long, and, yes, profoundly boring life story. And now, you wait again, not for the next footstep, but for the next curious eye, the next generation of humans seeking to understand the world that was. All that speed, all that life, all that history, it all flowed over you, for so long. Now, the flow has stopped. The noise has faded. The light is softer, or gone altogether. You are just a stone again, but a stone with a past etched into your very being. Feel the quiet settle around you. The air is still. There are no more footsteps, no more wheels, no more voices echoing overhead. Just stillness. A deep, profound quiet that allows you to sink, to settle, to simply be. Imagine yourself nestled back into the cool earth, or perhaps resting softly in a quiet, dark space. The long journey is over. The demands are gone. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to feel but the quiet weight of existence. Let the thoughts of roads and empires, of quarries and carts, of sun and rain, drift away like dust motes settling in the quiet. You are here, safe, still. Just rock. Resting. Drifting, settling, down, into the quiet dark.